and you find it helpful, please turn in it to 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter. This is where we'll be spending our time today. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, this is a particular passage, as most passages in the Scripture are, that has a lot of history attached to it. And unfortunately, for one reason or another, many times we neglect that history. And in doing so, we'll find ourselves not really understanding the passage in the way that it ought to be understood. If we neglect the history into which the writer writes, Paul is writing into a very specific history here in the city of Corinth. And he writes to this city of Corinth in a very specific way because of the city of Corinth and its history. So we need to have a grasp of that, I think. We don't in our lives really have a connection to idolatry. None of us have idol altars set up in our homes. Now, I've worked in homes that do have them. Worked in a home recently where Ganesh, the Hindu god that looks like an elephant, was set up. There was an altar to Ganesh in their home, a picture of the Swami, who is a disciple of Ganesh in the Hindu religion, and picture up on the wall, an altar set, places for food to be brought, offerings to be brought, incense to be burned, all of this. So it's not as foreign to some cultures, but for we who live here in the modern West, it's a very uncommon thing. None of us have altars like that in our home. For the Gentile and the Jewish converts in Paul's day, as he writes this letter to the church in Corinth, it's a very common feature of their lives. So let's take a look at this and see what this history would teach us. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and I'll begin reading in verse 1. With regard to food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge, but knowledge puffs up. However, love builds up. If someone thinks they know something, they don't yet know to the degree that they need to know. But if someone loves God, they're known by God. With regard then to eating food which has been sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol in the world is nothing, and that there is no God but one. However, after all, there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords. Yet for us there's one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we live, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. But this knowledge is not shared by all, and some, by being accustomed to the idols in former times, eat this food as a sacrifice to an idol, and their conscience, because it is weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We're no worse if we do not eat, nor better if we do. But be careful with this liberty we have, that it doesn't become a hindrance to the weak. For if someone weak sees you who possesses knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not their conscience be strengthened to eat the food offered to an idol? So by your knowledge, the weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed. If you sin against your brothers or sisters in this way and wound their weak consciences, you sin against Christ. For this reason, if food causes my brother or my sister to sin, I will never eat meat again, that I might not cause any of them to sin. Now, this is a very significant passage. There are a lot of details here for the history for Corinth that need to be understood in order for this passage to really make sense. For the pagans and the pagan converts who were in the church in Corinth, this is very significant for them. This means a lot for them. They have come from a tradition where there were idols set up. There were sacrifices made to these idols in the forms of animals that were edible. The animals were then cooked. The meat was sold, and that which wasn't consumed was sent out to the markets to be sold. So you could go into the market in Corinth, and a meat market, and buy meat. And some of it had been sacrificed to an idol in the pagan temple. Excuse me. So this doorway into idolatry was a doorway into many other forms of life in Corinth as well. It was a doorway into licentiousness, because an idol is moldable. An idol has no existence in and of it itself. So if you or I or some persons follow an idol, worship an idol, bring sacrifices to an idol, what the idol might demand of us becomes whatever we want it to demand. It doesn't mean that the idol has specific ideas about how we should live. We kind of craft those ideas. So you can see where if a person is an idolater, they can do whatever they want. And they can actually have the idol become an endorser of that which they would like to do. This was very common in Corinth at that time in history. Corinth was the capital city of the province of Achaia in the Roman Empire, a Greek province. And it was a tremendously wealthy city. It had a natural, it's constructed up on a precipice and very hard to attack. Corinth was never really taken in warfare directly. It was taken and destroyed at a certain point after all of the surrounding region had been taken. But Corinth itself as a city did not fall in warfare until gunpowder was invented. So it was a pretty hard place to get at. It sat on an isthmus, that is a little narrow strip of land between two seas. And what they would do in Paul's day is they would take ships, drag them up onto the shore. They would set rollers, logs in front of the ships, and they would drag them across the isthmus because it saved thousands of miles of travel by ocean, which was very dangerous in Paul's day. It was a very dangerous thing to travel by sea. And so you had this place where you had this commerce coming through this isthmus constantly. Trade ships coming back and forth, back. They taxed them. The Roman Empire had a lot of interest in Corinth. Corinth was destroyed in warfare, not attacked directly, but destroyed because of it being overrun by a general by the name of Mummius, a Greco-Roman general. Well, that was in 146 BC. 1 century later, the emperor decreed that Corinth should be rebuilt because it was such a prosperous place. They recognized that so much trade goes through here, we need to have it opened up once again. And so it was rebuilt under Julius Caesar. Now, Nero then, recognizing the difficulty of dragging boats about 80 years later, in the 60s AD, said, let's dig a canal. So they started it like the Panama Canal. But they never completed it. It wasn't completed until 1893. It took that long because it's rock. I mean, they just didn't have the facility to do that at that time in history. It had ports on both sides of the isthmus. So again, you've just got tremendous opportunity for commerce. And because of that, Corinth became one of the wealthiest cities in all of the empire. Well, what happens when a city becomes wealthy? License becomes very much part of that city's life. So if somebody said to you, you live like a Corinthian, that was not a compliment in that day. It was to say of you, you're debauched, you live for pleasure, you don't have any scruples or morals. That's what you're saying to somebody if you say you live as a Corinthian. There was a huge temple in Corinth to Aphrodite, the Greco-Roman goddess. And in the temple, there were 1,000 prostitutes that worked in the temple. Guess what the worship service was entailing when you went to the temple of Aphrodite with 1,000 prostitutes there in the temple. So this was all part of what it was to live in Corinth. In Paul's day, the city of Corinth was composed of about 200,000 free people and about 500,000 slaves. 700,000 people roughly lived in Corinth. This is why Paul writes this way to the church at Corinth, because of what the Corinthians are and from where they've come. Paul lists things in the letters to the church at Corinth. And by the way, there's one letter we don't have. There was a third letter, we don't have it. But in the 2 letters we do have, Paul lists stuff for them as goers to the church in Corinth to say, don't do this, don't do that. Simple stuff like don't steal. Why does he have to do that? Because they're in Corinth. Nobody had any morality in Corinth. You could do whatever you wanted. And the problems there rose up because for the Roman Empire, all they cared about were you pay your taxes and you don't create a riot. If you do that, we're going to leave you alone. We don't care what you do. You could have 1,000,000 prostitutes in the temple of Aphrodite. Do whatever you want at night. Do whatever you want anytime you want, as long as you pay your taxes and there's no rioting. We're happy with you. So from Paul's point of view, people were becoming Christians, coming out of the temple life in Aphrodite's temple, coming out of the Corinthian paganism, and they were becoming believers. And so for them, They look at this meat that's sacrificed to an idol, they take it seriously. Why, there are spirits that live in this meat. It's been in the idol's temple. It was held before an idol. It was sacrificed to the idol. There are spirits living in it. Now, I don't know if you remember back in Acts 15, you've got the Council of Jerusalem. The Council in Jerusalem wherein they were, the Jews who were becoming, the first converts were Jews. The first converts to Jesus were Jews. And as the church started to grow, they looked at the pagan converts, the Gentile converts, who didn't obey any kosher laws because they didn't know anything about them. They come into the church, the Jews who were converts were saying you need to obey the kosher laws. And so the Council of Jerusalem came about in response to that because these Gentile converts were complaining. We're a second-class citizen here. What's going on? I thought Jesus died for our sins. We didn't know anything about these kosher laws. You'll see in Acts 15 where the letter is given and it says, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. That's one of the things that they were warned against. All right, Paul here seems in some ways to be saying something very different, but he's really not. He's saying the same thing. He's just clarifying the theology that surrounds it. So what is he saying? Paul is saying, I understand what the torn veil means in the temple. When Jesus died on the cross, the veil of the temple was torn. Now you understand the temple, right? You got all these, it's like an onion. You've got the outer wall and the outer porch where that's the court of the Gentiles. Anybody could go there. Then the next barrier is the court of Israel. The men and the women who were Jews could go in there, but no Gentile could. Then you've got the court of the sons of Israel where the women couldn't go, but the men who were Jewish could go. Then you've got the inner parts of the temple, the sanctuary, where only the priests could go, the court of the Levites. And then inside there you've got the inner parts of the sanctuary where only the priests who were serving could go. And then you've got the veil that stands in front of the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple where God dwelt, where a priest went once a year to make the sacrifice on Yom Kippur. Well, that veil was torn from top to bottom when Jesus died. What does that mean? It means all the other barriers are gone too. Paul is telling them this. He's saying this is what the significance of the torn veil is here relative to this meat sacrificed to idols. He's telling them that which is theologically logical. If the veil of the temple's torn, all of these kosher barriers, all of the barriers between us and God are gone. Jesus has opened the way by the veil of his flesh. That's the argument in the letter to the Hebrews. Well, logic is a beautiful thing. I love it. I love logic. But logic can become a baseball bat over somebody's head if it's used wrongly. I mean, think about it. Paul says, knowledge puffs up, but love doesn't. Love builds up. So Paul's appeal here is logical, but it's also loving. He's appealing to love here to say, this is the way it really is relative to this meat sacrificed to idols. Think about it this way. I heard it said, it's a saying, I don't know who said it, I wish I did, it's a good saying, that truth without love can be brutal, which is true. But love without truth is hypocrisy, both of which are true. But think about it like this. I mean, I remember when I was a small child, like most small children, there were things I was kind of afraid of. My grandparents had a really big house there in Cherokee Heights. Had an upstairs, which, is not all that common here in the South. Most houses are single story. So we used to love to play in that house because it was one of those really big houses with a lot of rooms and you could find all kind of places to hide and stuff to do. My grandmother had this closet where she kept buttons. A huge box filled with buttons. She just collected them through the years. And we would love to go in there and just take the buttons out and mess with them because there are a lot of bright colors. No reason. What are you doing with them? I don't know. It doesn't matter. When you're 5 or 6 years old, they're just fun to play with. But there were also some other things in that closet. And I was scared to go in there to get the buttons. What was in there were a bunch of mannequin heads. Where one of her children during high school years, they had been for some school project, they had and there were those styrofoam mannequin heads and they were in various stages of completion on the shelf. Some had eyes, some didn't, some had hair, some didn't, some had a hat, some were fully facial, all the facial features. I was scared to death to go in there because I saw these things on the shelf. My grandmother knew better than to logically explain to me why I shouldn't be afraid. That didn't matter to me one whit. I was scared to death of all these heads. Logic is a great thing, but it doesn't work in all instances. It's no help whatsoever. All the logic in the world wasn't going to make me not afraid of those heads in that closet. That's what Paul's referring to here. He's saying, look, knowledge is good, but it tends to puff us up, and it lets us beat people over the head with it. But love builds up. For the Greek, this would just be like a freedom statement for them, because for the Greeks, they thought knowledge was the best thing in the world. That's why Paul says of the gospel, to the Jews a stumbling block, but to the Greeks, foolishness. That's why he says that. The Greeks thought themselves wise, but the Greeks were superstitious. And so for them, this meat sacrificed to these idols in the temple, sold in the market, was filled with spirits. And they were very superstitious to eat it. Now they've become Christians. And for them, for you or me, let's just put ourselves in this position. Let's say we know better, right? We know that an idol is nothing in the world. That's what Paul says. That's the logical statement. An idol is nothing. It's a block of wood, a piece of stone, a metal carving, whatever it is, it's nothing. But let's just say that you and I were there. We would know that, but maybe we've got some converts in the church who came from the occult. And for them, everything's got a spirit in it. And when they see us participating in eating the meat that's been sacrificed to an idol, they're shocked by it. When Paul says in the text, their consciences will be strengthened by seeing us eat the meat sacrificed to an idol, if they're pagan converts, that's sarcasm. That's not what really is going on. That's sarcasm. He's saying, oh yeah, you'll be strengthening their consciences to do what? To do that which is against their conscience and ruin them by it. A person who really knows a lot about something is a person who's really not going to know anything except what they don't know. This is what, for me, 4 years of theological education, all it did was tell me there's a vast universe of stuff out there that I don't know anything about. It opened my mind up to what I don't know. There's a difference between also knowing doctrine and knowing God, and that's what Paul is pointing to here. The doctrine is obvious. An idol is nothing in the world. But for somebody who's come from a pagan background, that is not what they're going to think. And it's going to ruin them to see you or me eating the meat that's been sacrificed to an idol or even buying it. Paul is making the case that dependence upon the law is weakness. That's the comparison. Somebody who's strong is not dependent on the law for their standing before God. Somebody who's weak, they are dependent on the law. And the eating of the meat sacrificed to idols was dependence upon the law. You're breaking a conscience law that a person has because of their background in doing that. He's also making the case that the conscience is our inner witness. You know, you and I move through this world and people will say, well, what things should we know that God is telling us to do or not to do? And the way that that comes to us is through our conscience. And that's really it. The inner witness of our conscience kind of tells us. And a conscience will tell us the truth here. An idol is nothing in the world. But if our consciences have been damaged because we've been part of the occult, then we're not going to see it that way at all. It's going to be a struggle for us. Let me just give you a kind of a practical way of looking at this. I had some friends, and I myself, my sister and I, my mother, we were involved in the occult. We enjoyed the occult. It was fun. It was something mysterious and dark, and it had an appeal to me. Well, I know now as a Christian that, say for instance, I could go to Walmart and go to the board game shelf and I could buy a Ouija board. Parker Brothers makes it. Same people that make Monopoly and Chutes and Ladders and a whole bunch of other games. And I could go buy one. And what if I were to buy one and bring it to a person who's become a Christian and give it to them, and yet they come from a background of deep involvement in the occult? they would look at that thing and see something far more than a piece of masonite with a piece of paper glued to it and letters printed all over it and numbers. They would see it as something spiritually significant. So we have to be careful in the way that we use the freedom we have, Paul is saying. Our freedom can become a cudgel, a club that we beat someone over the head with who might be more fragile in some of these ways that we're not fragile. Maybe we're strong there. I don't know how many of you struggle with foul language, not yourselves, but in hearing it. I do, because it was a struggle for me when I was not a believer. It was a huge struggle. When I first became a believer, foul language was one of the big things that I had to work on when I first became a Christian. For some people, it's no struggle at all. And so when they're in my presence as believers and I hear foul language come from them, it stings me in a way that it might not sting somebody else. I stumble over it to some degree. And we all treat things like this in our lives, various things. Think about it. How many of us have a lucky shirt? Or how many of us have a pair of lucky shoes? Or how many of us wear something around our neck with a symbol on it that we think is something we want? Don't want to leave the house without that. It's good luck for us. Or an amulet, or a coin, or whatever it is. An idol is nothing in the world. These things are nothing. They're just objects. But they can be deemed something in the world. And by that, a doorway can be opened into a realm that we don't want to be part of. There are only two poles of supernatural power in the whole of the universe. Only two. There are no neutral ones. It's either God or God's opposition. That's all there is. And so for these people in Corinth, they understood that to some degree. And for them, this was something tremendous to stumble over, this meat sacrifice to idols. But Paul is trying to communicate to them, there's only one God. There's no God but one in the whole of the world. But even though we know that, we need to be sensitive to people for whom some of these things really are a struggle. And as Paul says, if eating meat makes my brother or sister stumble, I'll never eat meat again. Boy, that's a high sacrifice just for the sake of other people's feelings. But it's one we should consider. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said